Hello, strangers. If you've been here before, welcome back. And if this is your first time, welcome. Settle in for another true, scary story. This one being story number 43. Me and my best friend were very into spooky stuff. She more so than I, but I had a crush on her. I was too scared to really analyze what that meant, confront the potential that I might be gay. But that did mean I was 100% on board for anything Shelley wanted to do. We went to a very strict private school, a religious one. There was no love for anything like that there. So when Shelley told me about this new scary thing people were doing, I was all ears. Apparently, much like Bloody Mary in the bathroom mirror, there was a way to summon something scary on a randomized webcam chat site. You had to light a candle, log into the site, click through repeating a phrase, and then something scary would appear. Now, I assume if you're hearing this story read out, you've been online before. And if you've been on random webcam chat sites, you know there are, indeed, some startling things on there. Did I really believe there was a ghost haunting a cam feed between bored 9-year-olds and dudes hanging dong? No. But I held my opinion that there was scary stuff, but not spooky scary stuff, on there to myself, and I readily agreed to try it with her. Shelley and I planned to do it at a sleepover. The thing was, I had recently gotten into big trouble leaving a candle burning in my room. I'd had the privilege of having lit candles and open flames taken away. In its place, and to please Shelley, I had bought a flickering, wickless LED candle. I hoped she wouldn't notice, and she didn't. Shelley rolled up in her light blue Dodge Neon just after dark, laptop in hand. We hung out in the family room for a bit, watching a movie with my parents. Around 11, feigning yawns, we told my parents goodnight and went back to my room. We wasted some time clicking around online, but as the time got closer to midnight, Shelley took up her position on the floor and brought the side up. I sat next to her, watching the little system clock tick down to midnight. Plan was, at the stroke of 12, I would light the candle, and Shelley would click the little spin button and begin the chant. And that's exactly what we did, except instead of lighting the candle, I simply flipped the little switch on the bottom. Did we see scary things? Yeah, but nothing supernatural. We kept going, and as we did, the few startling things stopped being shocking, started prompting us to giggle at some guy being gross or weird Jeff the Killer pictures. It was like being in a trance. I remember thinking that the LED candle was pulsing in rhythm with our clicks. And suddenly, the webcam window went dark. I caught her perfect reflection in the suddenly dark monitor, and I just leaned in to kiss her. And for a second, she kissed back. But when we kissed, we'd stopped the chant. And right on cue, the previously black screen started to illuminate something. We both watched it, and the face of a girl slowly came into view. It was fish belly white, the features blurred and smeary and pixelated. It had these dark, empty black eyes. As the little window continued to illuminate, clear up like someone off screen was telling a computer tech to enhance. I admit that I felt the hair on the back of my neck prickle, rise. See, it was a mask. A person wearing a mask. There was no blood. There was no jump scare. It was just someone wearing a mask in front of their camera. The only thing creepy about it was its somewhat ominous appearance. But as the light continued to come up in that little picture, as it cleared and lit more and more, something else was slowly fading into view. Something long, dangling in the background. As the light revealed more and more of it, I saw what it was. It was legs. Legs dangling from the top of the screen, twisting slowly, with purple sneakers. I gasped aloud, and Shelley grabbed the candle and blew. But nothing happened. She blew again, panicking. I was panicking too. I was starting to tell her it was an LED, but she started screaming at me to turn it off, turn it off. As more details of the mask and the sight behind it came into view, I grabbed it, turned it over, and flicked the off switch so hard I broke my fingernail down to the quick. Like magic, the computer window refreshed itself. The ghostly white mask seemed to stay like an echo on the newly black chat window box. I realized with a start that I wasn't seeing the mask. I was seeing Shelley's face reflected on the screen, white with fear and rage. To this day, I have never been cursed out to the extent that Shelley cursed me out, neither in the words she used or the volume. Her screaming of insults, slurs, including the one for girls who like girls, just a torrent of abuse, and that it was coming from my best friend and crush. It sent me into sobs, saying over and over how sorry I was. My parents burst in just as Shelley wound back her hand and delivered a full-on punch right into my left ear. The ringing and bright pain that followed made even my sobbed apologies incomprehensible, as was whatever my parents were shouting. My dad tore her to her feet and frog marched her out of the room. My mom comforted me, or tried to, but I was inconsolable. Hurt, physically, sure, but the rejection, calling me those things, it made the terror of what we'd seen on her laptop fade in comparison. You can probably guess what happened in the aftermath. My parents forbade us from hanging out. In part, I was bereft. In spite of the blow-up, Shelley had been my best friend for years. It's funny how many habits and reflexes you develop when you've been around someone since grade school. Like my first instinct upon my parents' grave punishment was to call my best friend to vent. But in other, more quiet parts, I felt relief. I'd stressed to death over not letting on about my feelings of unrequited love, that she'd known was humiliating, and made me stress over if I'd been obvious, if I'd made her uncomfortable, hence the blow-up. But then again, I had no idea she had it in her to spew slurs in my face like that. With all of that going on, the horror of what we'd seen on the laptop was such a distant third, I nearly forgot about it entirely. Going back to school the following week, my mind was on avoiding every spot and hangout I used to look forward to. But if you're feeling bad for me, don't. We made up, as it turns out, because like me, Shelley had the same ingrained habits. To be honest, it was fine by me. I mean, I was majorly sketched out by what we'd seen, but I was 1,000% more skeeved out by confronting my own feelings. So when she'd call, wanting to detail what we'd seen, I picked up and listened. At first, it just seemed like a put-on, but as days passed, Shelley started looking not so good. She wasn't sleeping, eating. She fainted in gym class, The weird thing was, she was just standing there. Then, boom, faceplant. Her texts were coming in at weird times, like 3 a.m. I was worried, but when I tried to ask her if she thought about talking to her parents, she subtly threatened to out me to mine. Too big of a coward to face the music on that with my own parents, I just tried to be there for her. That included taking those late-night calls and trying to talk her down. And you know what? I did. I may as well have been repeating my lines off a script, but it worked. The calls became less frequent. She wasn't sounding as frantic when she'd start spinning herself up about what we'd seen. That floating white face, the chanting, the candle that wouldn't extinguish. But with that, we stopped hanging out as much at school. When we did, the conversations became more and more mundane. We drifted apart our senior year, and that seemed to be that. I was again relieved. At first because it seemed more and more likely that she was getting over it, but also because I was getting over her. We became those sort of Facebook friends that just sent birthday wishes. At least we were. She wrote me one more time, asking about the chat, asking about that night. It was the first time she brought it up in ages. She finally said something that made me feel the fear anew. It wasn't my feelings that had set her off. She now could tell me as an adult she'd known. She hadn't felt the same way, and since I never pressed the issue, she figured time would take care of it. It was what we had seen appear behind the mask, hanging from the ceiling. When I had kissed her, for a moment, she'd leaned into it, thinking, what could the harm be? After all, she did love me. Maybe not in the way that I loved her, but she was willing to try it. At least, until she saw those legs. And as she brought that up, I could see in my mind's eye the little detail that had sent her into such a state. It wasn't so much the legs as the shoes, the purple sneakers. And it says something about how weird and off that night had been, because Shelley was my best friend. I'd known her for years, to the point where I recognized every outfit she had, and her go-to accessory were those purple sneakers. In the fright of that night, and in all those panicked conversations between then and now, I'd never made that connection. Simply put, Shelley had seen that as a warning. Remember, hyper-religious school, very unfriendly to the gays. Her rage had come from fear of hell and damnation. As I finished reading her messages and thinking about it, I found myself wondering what had scared me so much. Probably the confronting of my own feelings, the fear of rejection, of being found out. And maybe the scariest thing of all is that you out there listening live in a world with people who drive and vote and whose primary education had them believing in the Old Testament vengeance of a God who was petty enough to scare 2 young girls on a cold Friday night through chat roulette. Well, looks like we've stumbled upon another secret story. Once upon a time in the rural Midwest, there lived a boy named Jonathan, who, in that weird American tradition, is known as Jackie to his parents and basically everyone else. Jackie's family were farmers. They had grain, barley, alfalfa mostly, and also a fair amount of livestock. All the kids were expected to help out. Jackie's least favorite was the chicken coops. According to him, the smell, especially in a muggy summer, was as close to evil incarnate as he expected he'd ever get. Jackie was the youngest boy of 4 kids. They were raised Catholic, and the expectation was, as his older brother had done, Jackie too would serve as an altar boy. When the fated day came that his older brother passed him the torch, Jackie asked his brother if there was anything he needed to know about the priest. His brother shrugged and said he wouldn't know. They'd just gotten a new one, Father Rulin. But that he'd heard he was nice. And that was Jackie's first take upon meeting Father Rulin too. He, along with a couple of his friends, Tommy and Speedy, all went to the church to meet him to prepare for their turn in serving the congregation. If you're raised Catholic, especially in blue-collar towns, you need to understand the immense power and authority the church has over its communities. They are the end-all be-all, the law of the land. And priests are looked at as authoritarian as cops. If a priest tells you to stop doing something, you stop. The previous father, Father Moynihan, had been stern, taciturn even, and didn't have a lot of time for what he called tomfoolery. Father Rulin, on the other hand, was completely different. You might think that Jackie would have taken that as lucking out, that he had skipped the strict disciplinarian Father Moynihan that his brother had had to deal with, and was going to have an adult that, for all intents and purposes, appeared to be much more friendly, relaxed. The priest began by having them all sit, telling them he didn't stand on pomp or ceremony. They were surprised when, instead of standing before them to orate, give a lecture, he plunked down on the floor, sitting crisscross applesauce, looking at them expectantly, like, look at us, who would have thought? He asked them questions. Did they all go to the same school? How many brothers and sisters did they have? What did they like to do? He then began to speak of his own life, his own hobbies and interests. This struck Jackie as odd. He was still in that tender age where he still believed that most adults functioned like cuckoo clock figurines. At their appointed time, a little door would pop open, and they would pop out to do whatever one job they were meant to do. Teach, be a doctor or a dentist, work at a grocery store, and sell milk. The concept that adults had hobbies and interests and personalities, likes and dislikes, was a world he'd had yet to explore. As they sat, he began to squirm a little bit, uncomfortable with the concept that a priest, meant to be a statue of good and moral right, was acting not like that. It just felt very odd, and he knew he wasn't alone. Tommy kept swinging his legs anxiously, and Speed kept cutting side-eye to him, especially as Father Rulin's jokes transited from tame to raunchy. Soon the jokes ended, and the questions returned. But as with the jokes, the questions were different this time too. Simply put, he asked them when the last time they'd confessed was. The boys stammered and offered up week, maybe 2 weeks. And then, in front of God and everybody, Father Rulin asked what the naughtiest thing they'd done was, and suggested that, as long as he was involved, it couldn't be that bad. No need to confess if he was right there, eh? As he said this, he reached out a hand. Jackie remembered the hand looking spidery white, with knobby blue veins along the top of it, a hand that seemed somehow old, one that should have belonged to a cave dweller like Gollum from the Lord of the Rings books, instead of what appeared to be a young adult priest. And he watched in horror as that hand floated through the air and landed atop of one of Tommy's anxiously kicking legs, steadying it. At that touch, that wasn't even on his leg, but he felt as though it was, Jackie bolted up and blurted out the first excuse he could have, that the kids were late. They were meant to do chores, rake leaves at Speed's house. They had to get going. They all thanked Father Rulin, and off they ran. There was no leaf raking to do. The 3 boys ended up congregating at Jackie's house. Even without the watchful eye of the priest, Jackie still couldn't quite bring himself to discuss him. He was going against 9-10 years of programming to tell him that priests were objective moral authorities. But Speed's family were more of the cheerfully lapsed variety. Maybe that's why he felt easier to ask Tommy how he'd felt about Father Rulin copping a feel. The boys discussed it amongst themselves, unaware that while they did so, somebody was listening. Unaware, that is, until Jackie's own father came around the corner of the garage where they were gathered. Immediately, Jackie felt sick. He knew he was going to catch hell from his father for talking bad on priests. And sure enough, Jackie's father sent the boys away. But in turning to Jackie, he looked him dead in the eye and told him to repeat everything that he'd said, everything that he'd seen. And Jackie did, while he cringed internally, waiting for the blows to land to correct him from speaking ill of a priest. They never came. His dad merely knelt down, grasping him by the shoulders with his big old hands, leathery like baseball mitts. Jackie remembered what he said next, word for word. "You swear to me that everything you said is what happened, is true. You swear that, Jack?" All Jackie could say was, "Yes, sir." John Sr. stared at him a moment longer, then stood up and told him to run along. Jackie's family were staunch Catholics, but for a reason that nobody felt the need to explain to Jackie, the following Sunday, they skipped Mass. It was a little over a week later or so, Jackie estimates, that he woke up. It was dark outside, in that sort of queasy space between late night and early morning, where little kids get that sort of devilish tickle that they're not supposed to be awake, that even being conscious during these hours is some sort of sin, and a delightful one at that. He lay in bed under the scratchy red comforter until he heard a sound, and realized he'd woken up because he'd heard something. The sound seemed to be coming from outside. Now, Jackie's family had lots of dogs, and even some floodlights, but coyotes and other predators are known to thwart such when they want a meal. And Jackie figured as long as he was awake, there'd be no harm in taking a little look, maybe raising the alarm if needed. Farm families are like that. Every person in a farm family has to share the weight, good or bad. So Jackie got up, put on his robe and wandered out, found his galoshes, put them on, and walked outside, following the sound of the noise. He didn't need to go far, nor did he need to navigate by sound alone. A blaze of light confirmed that the activity was all happening in the hanging locker. As he approached, Jackie heard another sound, a meaty thwack sound, followed by another high-pitched squeal. Hogs, then. Somebody was slaughtering a hog. But why so late? Before Jackie could really explore this, really shake the dust from his sleep-addled brain, the door swung open, and there stood his father, John Sr. John Sr. was all kitted out in his usual hog-slaughtering fashion. The galoshes, the green rubber apron, faded from many washes, was still clean of any blood. Good. So he hadn't started yet, not in earnest. Jackie inwardly groaned. As the youngest son, when any task came to hand, including hog slaughtering, he usually got stuck with the gopher work. And helping clear away the steaming piles of entrails at this hour in the evening, wearing his pajamas and robe, wasn't exactly what he had in mind. And it didn't appear it's what his father had in mind either. He was surprised, asked Jackie what he was doing. Jackie responded that he'd heard a noise and asked if his father was slaughtering a pig. John Sr. paused and then nodded. From behind his dad, he heard another sound, a sort of muffled squeal. He looked again at his father. Everything seemed right down to the rubber apron, faded from years of use but currently clean. And just when Jackie feared that he would be pressed into service, his father looked at him with those tight, serious eyes and said, "Jackie, you'll be wanting to get to bed." Jackie needed no further encouragement. Jackie turned to make his escape, but before he did, he turned back, smiled at his dad, and said, "Love you." He looked at his father's eyes and felt a lump rise in his throat. His father's eyes looked tight and serious. He dropped his eyes down to his father's big, leathery hands, rough hands, yet comforting, familiar, and noticed a small smear of something across the knuckles. Then Jackie turned and did as he was told, to go back to the house and go back to bed. He trudged across the lawn, back up into the house, pulled off his galoshes, robe, got back into bed. It was only as he was falling asleep that he wondered why his father was slaughtering a pig at all. Their icebox was currently filled to the brim. Where would they be able to put it? But by morning, the thought, like many other half-asleep thoughts, had slid completely out of his mind. The family resumed going to Mass, but Jackie did not become an altar boy. Another decision that no one felt the need to explain to him. Not that he was going to ask why. And while he did initially keep a watchful eye out, Jackie never saw Father Rulin around the church again. He assumed that, but they were a small farming town, the population seeming to dwindle by the year. Surely their parish was small enough that it had been decided that they didn't need an extra priest as much as the next parish over. Time passed, and Jackie, on his way to becoming Jack, forgot all about it. Jack married a girl and had 2 kids of his own, and one day, his youngest, a girl, came home excited to watch a movie with him, a movie called Searchlight. For those who haven't seen it, and you really ought to, Searchlight explores the story of the first mainstream media to really break wide open the Catholic Church scandal of shuttling pederast priests from parish to parish as they're discovered. At the end of the film, Jack's daughter looked at him and asked, wasn't he raised Catholic? Did he maybe know of any of these happening? And Jack opened a drawer and reached back into a time when he was known as Jackie. He thought about his father's tight, gray eyes. He thought about that creepy, squirmy earthworm sensation, that floating white hand, bulbous veins atop it, crawling. He thought about his father's hands, the comforting familiarity of those rough, sandpaper mitts clasping on his shoulders, and how quickly he'd gone from concern to feeling very safe indeed. And so, he turned to his daughter and he told this story. Only as he told it did he finally put together one dangling thread, those comforting leathery mitts with the smear of red across the knuckles, the squealing in the slaughter shed, the disappearance of Father Rulin. Grandpa John was a Vietnam vet, hardcore, hard-bitten in all senses of the word. Law-abiding to a point, but never afraid to get his own hands dirty when he felt the situation called for it morally or otherwise. What happened that night in the slaughter shed, And where did Father Rulin go? If he ever went anywhere? These are probably questions that will never be answered. They don't need to be, because the answer is simple. A father's love and his willingness to protect his children supersedes others, even if they call themselves a father too. At this point, I'm not sure which part of my life is going to provide the most stories. The military part, the tattooed and scene kid part, or the growing up in a very, very strict religious part. I guess those at home keeping score can let me know, as well as liking, commenting, or subscribing, if you so choose. Until next time, stay strange, but stay safe. And take care, strangers.